All right, so white nationalist propagandist and supposed or self-proclaimed anti-war crusader Tucker Carlson had some thoughts on Biden's withdrawal from Afghanistan and why the U.S. ended up losing this war catastrophically to the Taliban. And let's just say I disagree with a lot of the things that he's going to say in this clip. In fact, a lot of it and pretty much all of it is laughably absurd. So let's go ahead and hear what Big Tuck over here had to say.
But first, since Kabul has just fallen, it might be worth asking the most obvious question of all. Why did the Taliban win? How did the 6th century triumph over the 21st century? There are indications that the single most notorious and reviled government in the world, primitive people famous for their brutality, rigidity, and humorlessness.
Primitive people? Okay, racist motherfucker, but continue, please.
Are more popular in parts of Afghanistan than they were when we expelled the mullahs from Kandahar 20 years ago. They don't seem to be less popular. So how did that happen? What's the answer? We ought to pause to think about that. Let's not just blow past it like it was an act of God. It's not. What is the answer? Well, countries are very complicated, all of them, so there are likely many answers. But one of those answers may be that the population of Afghanistan has firmly rejected what our leaders were selling it over 20 years. It turns out that the people of Afghanistan don't actually want gender studies symposia. They didn't actually buy the idea that men can become pregnant. They thought that was ridiculous. They don't hate their own masculinity. They don't think it's toxic. They like the patriarchy. Some of their women like it too. So now they're getting it all back. So maybe it's possible that we failed in Afghanistan because the entire neoliberal program is grotesque. It's a joke. It's contrary to human nature. It answers none of our deepest human desires. It is merely a performance staged for the performer. It's not even supposed to improve your life. It's ridiculous. And ideas that ridiculous can only be imposed by force, only with armed men at gunpoint. The moment these ideas are not mandatory, the second the troops withdraw, in fact, people tend to revert to the lives that they prefer to live. That may be the real lesson of Afghanistan. Let's hope our leaders notice it.
Okay, so apparently, according to Tucker Carlson at least, the main reason that our troops were in Afghanistan was to violently enforce gender studies classes on them, probably bringing over some of these radical left communist teachers and professors from our universities and shipping them off to Afghanistan to go lecture the Taliban on gender studies. That is literally what he just portrayed our presence in Afghanistan as, okay? Listen, our entire presence in Afghanistan from the beginning in building up this process with this Afghan government that we were putting in place that proved itself at the end to just be a completely fabricated government that didn't really exist in any way. They didn't put up a fight in any way, shape, or form. Tucker Carlson wants you to believe that the reason why we went into Afghanistan was to enforce some radical left social order in Afghanistan. Bro, George W. Bush began the war in Afghanistan. Was George W. Bush a radical left, a social justice warrior type? Is that what George W. Bush was? I don't think that Tucker Carlson would think that George W. Bush is a social justice warrior in that way. But in addition to that, this is Tucker Carlson, the guy who goes out on his show every single day and pretends to be some anti-war crusader, right? He will be sometimes critical of the neocons. He will be critical of George Bush. He was not critical at all whatsoever on a war front of Donald Trump, right? He pretended as if Donald Trump was the guy who was the big anti-war crusader as well. He obviously wasn't. He failed to get us out of Afghanistan. Biden succeeded in doing that, and suddenly those praises that Tucker had for Donald Trump for beginning the process of removing ourselves from Afghanistan, suddenly that turns into a total failure and a massive breakdown by the Biden administration on this front. So he literally thinks that the Taliban or the Afghan people were receiving gender studies lectures, and that's why the U.S. military was there wielding violent force to impose our leftist social values on the country. It's laughable at face value. And honestly, the way that he was talking about it, right? He was talking about it as, well, the Afghan people are rejecting a lot of these left-wing social ideas of, he threw out some transphobic arguments there, as he typically would. But this really just comes across as a pro-Taliban argument, right? If you were to watch that clip in its entirety, start to finish, you would probably walk away not knowing anything else about Tucker Carlson, that he supports the Taliban, right? Because he was literally just saying, well, they're brave enough to go and reject these American social values that we are trying to impose on them. They were brave enough to do that. The Afghan people were brave enough to pick the Taliban over these leftist social values. That's literally the argument that he's laying out there. It's not in tune with reality in any way, shape, or form, because again, we weren't pushing gender studies programs on the Afghan people. But on top of that, the actual reason why we stayed in Afghanistan over the last 20 years to build up this government that was supposedly going to be the counterbalance to the Taliban, and even if we didn't fully suppress the Taliban, then maybe there could be some sort of agreement between them. The reason why all of that collapsed is because the goal of the government, the goal of building that government by the U.S. State Department, was never to create a fully functioning, well-oiled democratic machine for the Afghan people to, eventually be able to actually self-govern and have some sort of a democratic functioning system. In fact, the reason why we initially got involved in Afghanistan way back under the Reagan administration was to overthrow a democratic socialist government and fund the Mujahideen fighters to take on the Soviet Union, and the Mujahideen fighters who we then funded became the Taliban. So right now, this entire situation that he has, the failure of this Afghan government to defeat the Taliban, first of all, we have responsibility for the Taliban existing in the first place in the way that it does. Then over the entire 20 years of this war, the Taliban only got stronger as troop presence continued to surge under the Obama administration. It didn't make a difference. The Taliban was stronger at the end of the war than they were at the beginning of the war. We just lost the war. And the reason why the Afghan government couldn't stand on its own 2 feet after that, the $100 billion that we put into the Afghan government, the weapon supplies, the training that we gave them, 300,000 soldiers that we trained over the course of those 20 years, the reason why it couldn't stand and the reason why it didn't have popular support was because it was extremely corrupt. It was because we were working with child pedophile warlords in Afghanistan, and then trying to prop up this government that was entirely corrupted, that didn't serve the interests of average Afghan people. So why the fuck would they pick that government, that corrupt US-backed, US-funded, US-weaponed government, over the Taliban? It just doesn't make any sense. Of course, these local people who have a lot more experience in the region and who are pushing back against this imperial force that is occupying the country for multiple decades, of course they would end up being more popular in the end, but that doesn't have anything to do with goddamn gender studies. So Tucker Carlson obviously not only does not actually believe in anti-imperialism, he's not an anti-war crusader as he pretends to be, but he also just doesn't really seem to understand the actual dynamic of why we lost the war in Afghanistan.